Okay, good evening and welcome to the latest installment of Building the Scottish State with myself, Dr. Mark McNaught. And I have the great pleasure of having with me on this 11th of November, Colin Fox, the main spokesman for the Scottish Socialist Party. So first of all, Colin, thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you, mate. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to be here on Indie Live again.
Exactly. So if we can just start by, if you could just give us a quick biography of yourself, just, kind of where you come from, what your background is, and how you came to politics and what politics means for you personally.
Yeah, sure. I was born in Motherwell, 1959, for those who want the facts and figures. I was a member of the Labour Party Young Socialists when I was 18. So my background is in the Labour Party. And then I've been 40 years a professional socialist. Isn't that fantastic? So I'm honoured and delighted I've been able to pursue a life that I've wanted, which has been great. I was on the Yes Scotland Advisory Board. People might remember that from the 2014 referendum. I was a member of the Scottish Parliament for the Scottish Socialist Party, representing the Lothians between 2003 and 2007. I've been a founder member of the Scottish Socialist Party since 1998 when it was founded. And more recently, I've been involved in the COP26 protest, celebration, investigation, whatever it's called, of the last week or so. And I suppose my latest accolade, I was part of the monsoon march of last Saturday, where we're told that under global warming, Scotland will get wetter. So it's a double reason for us to fight against global warming and ensure that the world's a more equal place than it is just now. So that's really encapsulates my background, I think, Mark.
Okay. And what does it mean to be a socialist for you? I mean, I come from the United States and, socialists are terrible people. It's communist. It's all these horrible things. But I'm well aware that, that's not the case. But, for me, I kind of define socialism as, quite simply as the government, if it's a socialist government, in a sense that it invests the kind of the profits from society, not necessarily monetary, but reinvests the productivity and what is produced back into the society to make it better. That's kind of my very kind of simple operating definition. And I'm wondering if how you see it.
It's a really good question. I think when I was 18, growing up in Motherwell, my belief and perception then that everybody was a socialist. Everybody that I knew in Motherwell was a socialist. Everybody considered themselves to be socialist. This is the late 70s, early 80s. But what is socialism? I'm a scientific socialist. I think that's a clear distinction. Scientific socialists like me want to see things proven. It's like we're
maybe empirical socialist. Yeah,
I believe in. I'm inspired by the Enlightenment. I'm inspired by the works of Marx. People who can prove what they're arguing, rather than it's just a sort of a bias or a prejudice or a feeling that they have or a sentiment. And growing up in Motherwell, funny enough, the first ever Labour MP, Keir Harvie, was born in Motherwell. He didn't represent Motherwell at that stage. He did become an MP till later on, but that part of Lanarkshire's got really strong socialist traditions. The world's first utopian socialist experiment was Robert Owen in New Lanark, during the Industrial Revolution. But I suppose the best way to explain what socialism is to define the economic system we live under is capitalism. It's capital, the use of capital, which replaced the feudal period and going backwards rather than forwards. But I would describe myself as an anti-capitalist. I see a world that could be better than the present one if the resources and the wealth that was generated was shared out to those who need help the most.
That's basically what I meant when I was kind of defining what socialism is.
You're on the same territory. And the United States and Britain are amongst the most unequal countries in the world, because what happens is that the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer. And that's the wrong way around. That's what capitalism represents. Socialism represents the opposite, where we take the wealth, we distribute it evenly, and we see humankind's potential getting the opportunity to flower. So I think that would be the way I would explain it.
Yeah, because I've been watching a lot of Noam Chomsky videos over the last couple years, and really, and you learn he does is a really good video that anybody can watch on YouTube. Just type in Noam Chomsky Madisonian democracy, but it talks about basically how the United States was designed to keep the aristocracy or the oligarchy in place, especially the slaveholding landowners, and to keep a lid on democracy, because just in 1786 there was the Shays Rebellion, where a bunch of irate farmers in Massachusetts were very unhappy about the collection of taxes, and so they like rose up with pitchforks or guns or whatever, and the landowners were spooked. And they were like, "Oh, we can't have this. We can't have democracy." And so
I've read a lot of Chomsky. I think Chomsky's writings on American imperialism are fantastic. And I know he's a certain age now, Noam Chomsky, and he's probably done his best work before. But I've also been fascinated as a socialist. The socialist journey in the United States of America is, on the one hand, hugely inspiring. People like John Reed, people like Mother Jones, the Wobblies in the 1900s and all that, the Haymarket Massacre that led to the world's first celebration of May Day. On the one hand, it's immensely inspiring. On the other hand, you take your hat off to people who are socialists in the United States, people like Bernie Sanders, because the odds stacked against them are absolutely incredible. It's worse than anywhere else you'll find,
I mean,
and actually,
you have Bernie Sanders, you got maybe 5 or 6, what you could call socialists in the House of Representatives, but they're up against such a massive corporate, wall.
And they're also, the truth is, the United States, it developed in a very unique way. We see from this side of the pond, we look at the gun massacres in the United States and that come up periodically, scratch your head going, what on earth is that about? And yet, the truth of the matter, it goes very back to the foundations of the United States, where people, they fought for the right to bear arms to protect themselves from the state. That's not a conception of this side of it.
To a certain extent, but the reason the Second Amendment was included was basically to maintain slavery, because there was in the air there was the abolition of slavery kind of on a worldwide basis. There were, I think, Spain maybe had banned slavery in their colonies, and in the States they had these basically slave patrols or slave in the different colonies and later in the States, because if you're going to keep a huge percentage of the population enslaved, you got to have a lot of guns, and you got to be able to have patrols to make sure that they don't escape, to capture them if they do escape. And so that was the main thing. But there's no question that I see it less now, as I used to subscribe to that view of that they wanted to have it against the government, which is definitely true. But there were more, but there was also the question of slavery and, the massacring of the Indians.
I suppose you've also got the United States that it starts in the East Coast and it goes west and west and west over a century. I mean, people would remember that. What was California like in the 1900s? The California of today, with San Francisco, Los Angeles, the freeways, Silicon Valley, etc. It's almost inconceivable to imagine anything at all similar to that essentially in a quarter beforehand. And it was because it seems to me the United States' history evolved east to west. You had Chicago right through, and
it was kind of east, moving east, and then west, starting from 1850, and then kind of bringing it all together in the middle. Basically, because they expelled all of the Indians kind of encircled them on a big geographic scale and kind of compressed them into what is now Oklahoma. But you're absolutely right from a certain extent. But it was more kind of east, going further east, grabbing the west, and then just on that. But,
and I suppose in a sense that as a socialist, you look at the United States of America, and as a socialist, I'm an internationalist. My view is that we're all the same. Fundamentally, we're human beings with the same needs and aspirations, and we try to treat each other the same way. And therefore, if I want to see a socialist world, it's inconceivable we're going to see a socialist world without seeing a socialist United States of America. And I suppose it's now debatable whether or not China or America is, the the key force in the 21st century, right? But leaving that to one side, the United States is a fascinating area, you know, a country, I suppose a semi-continent to consider how it's developed in the 20th century and how it completely changed from where it was at 1900 to where it was as the supreme leader in the world, or the preeminent power in the world by 2000. So anyway, fascinating.
Okay. All right. Absolutely. We'll leave that. We'll park that for the time being and get back to Scotland. So, so tell me about your involvement in the COP, besides the depressing prospect that Scotland's going to get even wetter. Tell us about your involvement in the COP.
Well, I think the key thing that strikes me, COP26 is obviously in Glasgow, isn't it? And the message that I'm trying to go over, and I think is surely got to be the central one, is whatever solutions we come forward with to combat global warming and climate change, they've got to make our lives better. They've got to make the lives of the 8 billion people on the planet better. Otherwise, they're not going to work. You're not going to get 8 billion people to buy in to the lifestyle changes and all the other, you know, attitudinal changes without there being some advantage in it for them. So the Scottish Socialist Party has been at the forefront of campaigning, for example, for free public transport. If transport in Scotland is the biggest emitter, it's the biggest problem with CO2.
And worldwide.
Well, then part of that, we've got to get people to get out of their car. Yeah. And it seems to be the best way to get people to leave their car at home is to give them a better alternative. Free buses, free trains, free trams in Edinburgh, free underground in Glasgow. Give people a better alternative to using their car and they'll take it. And I have to say, I was commuting largely back from Edinburgh and Glasgow over the last week. And it is a miserable experience being in Edinburgh City Bypass for an hour and in the M8 for an hour. And I don't think it's difficult to jettison the idea. Do you know what? I'll sit in the train and read my book or listen to your show than stuck in a traffic jam for an hour and a half, feeling increasingly miserable because I can't get to where I want to go to, and it's costing me a fortune. So I think free public transport's an idea whose time has come. I noticed in the last year, Luxembourg announced that they were introducing it. And last month, the island of Malta in the Mediterranean announced that they're introducing it. And Saturday, I think it was in Glasgow, might have been Friday, I met a woman from New York City. And she said that New York City has free public transport at Christmas and New Year time. And it's principally to discourage people from drink driving, office parties, this kind of thing, right? And I realised that was its main motive. It's not necessarily the same as reducing climate emissions, but I've been to New York City, fantastic city. I've been there 4 or 5 times, brilliant. The idea that you have free public transport in New York City, albeit for a week or 10 days, and we can't somehow have it in Scotland, is for the birds. And I think that's, you know, that's the way, that's one of the measures, progressive thinking measures, enlightened measures, if I can use that word, that we've been advocating. And the other main part of the argument we proffer is we've got to take back into public ownership gas, electricity, renewables, for example. The air is free, the wind is free, the tides are free, the sun is free. These should be energy sources that belong to the people. And maybe in Scotland that can help us also go a long way to eradicating the scourge of fuel poverty that we suffer so badly here every year, with tens of thousands of people dying of the cold. So it's joined up thinking on climate change, if you like. That's what we're trying to advocate.
Okay. And can you give me some other examples? I mean, free public transport is certainly a good one, but what are some other examples you can give of changes that would make, that would benefit the climate, but that would also at the same time improve people's lives?
There's many of them.
Just not having heating and flooding and all that.
No. I mean, we're going to have to address domestic heating. I mean, our domestic heating in Scotland, most people's domestic heating is gas fired. So that's got to be replaced by, heat pumps or stuff like that. But I tell you one that might make you chortle a wee bit. Scotland doesn't have a great propensity for eating as many fruit and vegetables as we should. The government's got a health message saying you should be eating 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day. And I know for most people in the west of Scotland where I grew up, they're not really sure what a fruit is. They think potatoes are a vegetable. Anyway, on climate change, we're going to have to move to a plant-based diet. You can forget meat and dairy and the produce because of methane, because of the consequences to the environment. So one of the things we're going to have to embrace is moving towards a plant-based diet, soya, these kind of things. And I have to say, my children, my two kids, my daughter's a vegan, my partner's a vegetarian. It's possible to live on fruit and vegetables, it's possible to live without meat. I think that's one of the lifestyle changes that we're going to have to take on board too. But it's because the consequences of not doing this are so profound. They're existential threat to humanity itself. So there's another couple of ideas, yeah.
Yeah, and a good point, a point very well taken on in terms of reducing meat consumption. I have my colleague at the university. She's teaching a class on animal rights, and I told her that I'd reduced my meat consumption considerably. I still eat, the odd pork chop or whatever, but she said that that's the best thing you can do for the planet. To reduce your carbon footprint is to stop eating meat. So
yeah, I mean, socialists like me, I think the role individuals can play is important, but essentially, when you've got 8 billion people, you need collectivist solutions. We've all got to buy into it. One person giving up a pork chop and eating a McBurger, a McPlant. They call it a McPlant, the new vegetarian burger at McDonald's. 1 or 2 people doing that won't make a blind bit of difference. We need to get. You think of the world's, the population of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, the Southeast Asia. These are poor countries, poor people, billions of poor people, who've got very, very little opportunity to get any kind of diet, etc. So I think what we're looking at, the solutions have got to be aimed at them in particular. Otherwise, it's just gesture politics from the rich Western world, So we've got to make sure everybody can buy into it. And, I think as a socialist and a progressive, I've always believed in the carrot rather than the stick. Give people a better alternative, they'll take it. Don't order them, don't hit them up the backside with a big stick in order to, persuade them to change their point. People dig their heels in those circumstances. It's generally speaking not the most productive and advantageous way to progress, So I'm constantly looking about how would you change the lifestyle of the average Indian or the average Bangladeshi or the average Ecuadorian peasant, you know what I mean? Where's the solution that they can make towards climate change, or the contribution that they can make towards climate change? And to me, these are countries with enormous populations that can make a big, big difference to the overall picture. It has to be a global solution to this, doesn't it? Individual countries won't solve climate change on its own if everybody else is ignoring the message.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to go back to just a question to address, just because we were just talking about it. How would we pay for all the free transport? In my view, again, I mean, first of all, the government can, if the government, whether it be the Scottish government, well, not now, but the UK government, if they can produce out of thin air enough money to finance Trident and all this other stuff, then there's no reason they can't produce money out of thin air to pay for public transport.
Well, it's a good question, Mark. I mean, 2 things I'd say. The Scottish Socialist Party MSPs, I mentioned before that we had 6 MSPs in the Scottish Parliament between 2003 and 2007. And we put forward a bill in 2005 to the Holyrood Parliament proposing free public transport in Scotland. And the then Transport Minister, Tavish Scott, he was a Liberal Democrat at that stage, but I don't know what he does now. But he was the Transport Minister at the time, and he said, no, we couldn't possibly afford it. It would cost £500 million a year. And I remember in the debate pointing out to him, trying helpfully to say, no, Tavish, you're wrong. £500 million wouldn't come anywhere near it. It'll be at least £1 billion, because what you'd forget is you will need extra buses and trains and trams to cope with extra demand and the infrastructure. But the point I said is £1 billion. I think it was Lord Stern at the very first intergovernmental conference on climate change said, the cost of doing nothing is the most expensive option of all.
Exactly.
And when you look at £1 billion today, bear in mind how much money was spent bailing out the banks in 2008. Right on. It ran to 150 times that in Britain alone. And you look at the amount of money that the government, rightly, I have to give credit where it's due, they spent in the last 18 months to 2 years on COVID and supporting the economy. And it runs to 50, 60 times that. And it was right to do it. And when it's right, you should spend the money. And the second side of the equation is if it costs £1 billion to, and effectively, I think that calculation comes not just from the extra buses and trains you need, but it's principally from the loss of revenue you'd get from not charging people. But you also have to factor in as if there's buses, you know, people traveling by buses and trains, they're not traveling by cars, so there's less travel, there's less car accidents, there's less pollution, which has its own health impact, and above all,
less wear on the roads,
of course, and above all, where all the economists will point out, the greatest saving is the amount of money you save in business from a decongested economy in all those centres of the cities. So you've not got lorries stuck in traffic for an hour on end, not delivering to where they've got to go. It's got a consequent impact on production, on the wider economy as a whole. So there would be a cost. It would still be a net cost. There's no way of camouflaging it would be a net cost overall, because these don't add up to more than $1 billion. But it boils down to a much, much smaller demand on the public purse that's perfectly possible to carry going forward. So it's an idea and a debate that, as I said, I think that its time has come and the debate is becoming much more sensible and realistic. And cities, I think in the downtown areas of several US cities, they have introduced free public transport to free up the congestion they find in downtown Salt Lake City, for example, is one of them. So I think we're pushing against an open door with that proposal.
Okay. All right. I wanted to shift now to the route to independence, and I'm just wondering where you see it at this point. You were obviously you were heavily involved in the 2014 referendum. It didn't go through for whatever reason, and it's been several years that we just don't. We've had 3 mandates for Westminster with overwhelming majorities of pro-independence, supposedly pro-independence MPs being elected. And even back in Margaret Thatcher's time, that would have been considered sufficient to become independent. But I don't know where that changed, but they're not using that standard anymore. And it doesn't appear that there's been much, if any, if at all, preparation on the part of the Scottish government for other than maybe, we'll have a public bank, or we'll have this or that. But I'm just wanted to get for me, there has been numerous mandates, and but there's been little or no preparation for independence, at least that we know about. And the idea of having a Section 30 order referendum, I don't know when it would happen, and I don't know if it would be a good thing. So I was just wondering. I wanted to get
sure. I mean, first of all, I'd say, Mark, I share your passion for independence. I mean, the Scottish Socialist Party has been committed to independence for the 25 years of our existence. We want to see a independent socialist Scotland, and in that regard, our tradition, if you like, can be traced back to the days of John McAllion and the Red Clydesiders at the turn of the 20th century. James Connolly, the great Edinburgh socialist who was executed by the British in the Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916, was a passionate advocate of a Scottish Workers' Republic. So was John McAllion. So for our tradition, independence is not a means to an end, or is a means to an end in as much as we want to see independence thrown off the shackles the British state has in Scotland. And we're passionate about it, and therefore it's really, really important to us and has been for all that period of time. And that's why we're involved in the Yes campaign. It's why I was involved in the advisory board, etc., the Scottish Independence Convention. Now your question is basically quite rightly painting the picture. The debate just got serious really quickly. This has become a very serious debate, much more serious than it's probably ever been before. The route to independence, we have to look at it and say, look, the polls, the most important thing about the polls is they all show the same picture. We don't have a majority yet. There's not a majority in Scotland. The people of Scotland, by majority, don't support independence. We have to make sure that that's the case as soon as we possibly can. It's close. The figures maybe 45 to 50, around about then, with some don't knows. So the debate's really serious. And I have to say that the Section 30 order that you refer to is really, really important. Boris Johnson, although Boris Johnson can be easily dismissed as a buffoon and with straggly hair and he's eating ways and the rest of it, the fact is he's a serious representative of British unionism, and they're adamant Scotland's not going to get its independence. You're not getting a Section 30 order. You're not getting a second referendum. The lesson they learned in 2014 was this was far too close for comfort.
Yeah.
They're not about to allow the same thing to happen again. So their tactics are perfectly clear. I'm interested in our tactics and our plan for victory and our strategy for winning. We can't afford a second referendum that we lose. Look what happened to Quebec.
Oh, I understand that. I understand.
So we can't afford to lose a second time. So we've got to be serious. And I look and I see Boris Johnson saying, you're not getting a Section 30 order. And you need that Section 30 order because the law is clear. The 1997 Scotland Act that established the Holyrood Parliament made it clear which powers are reserved and which are devolved. And the Constitution is reserved to London. It's not devolved to Edinburgh. They don't have any power. And there was a famous, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher there. You know, she had a more serious Tory intellectual alongside her called Enoch Powell, who's dismissed from history as a real racist and all the things he did there.
I didn't realize that they were so close. I knew that Enoch Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech.
He made his, but more importantly than that, he made this statement to say that power devolved is power retained.
Yeah.
Very clever. He was very clever. He might have been a Tory. He might have been the other side of the fence from us.
No,
but he's essentially, they're not stupid. And I've never done it, and I'm sure you don't do it. I never underestimate my enemy. And in a serious battle like this, I'm damned if I'm going to underestimate the unionists who don't want to see Scotland being independent. What he meant was, if I've got the power to set up a Scottish Parliament, I've got the power to pull the plug in it too. I'll determine the powers it gets. I'll determine what's reserved and what's devolved. And so we're in a reality. The Section 30 order is in the gift of Westminster. I understand it's not in the gift of Holyrood. And Westminster, the Tories have got an 80-seat majority. So the 650 MPs, only 50 of them support independence. That's a problem.
Okay, well, I just want to inform you a little bit about what we were speaking about before in the group that I'm working with, the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group. And we've talked to a lot of good people. We have, several really, really good intellectuals on our group. And basically, we've determined that, this is our interpretation of the law, of course, but the union is based not on the Scotland Act, but it's based on the Treaty of Union of 1706-07. And there's no reason why as Margaret Thatcher was arguing, or held, the view that she held was that if a majority of Scottish MPs want to withdraw from the Treaty of Union, they can. Because there seems to be, you're perfectly correct in what you're saying about the Scotland Act and all this, but at the base of it, the union is based on the Treaty of Union, and under international law, any party is perfectly entitled to withdraw from that treaty when they want, and the UK is pretty much, is essentially an imperial power. And if they say, oh, no, you can't withdraw from the Treaty of Union, well, then, they're not abiding by international law. And, I think that's where our energy should be focused on convincing, the MPs and the MSPs that, that they're supposedly in a union of equals. And fundamentally, Scotland, the sovereignty that was established in the Declaration of Arbroath, reaffirmed in the Claim of Right of 1689, and even as recently as 2018 was reaffirmed, in the House of Commons. The Scottish government has every right to withdraw from the Treaty of Union, thus ending the union.
I've heard this many times, Mark, I have to say, and with all due respect, it doesn't move me any. I think, the difficulty with this, the proposition is we move this debate into the courts. I'm not interested in the courts. The courts are for fancy dancing lawyers that are getting paid £500 an hour. And if the independence debate ends up in the courts, we're buggered. Independence will be won in the street. It'll be won by democratic participation in the, as towns and small cities in Scotland. And I have to say that the battle we face is a simple battle. Boris Johnson's made it clear this is a Section 30. If you want a second referendum, we have to give you permission for it. You're not getting permission. So there is no progress to be made through the courts. 1707 is 350 years ago. There's no point in going backwards all the time into history. We are where we are. If they say, a week is a long time in politics, well, 350 years is a hell of a long time. And I'm
Little
not
less than that,
interested.
but yeah.
Yeah, but I'm not interested in going back into, kind of arcane debates
But
in history because the population of Scotland are untouched by it. The population that we need to persuade want answers about their wages, about their pay and conditions, about what on earth you have to do in Scotland to get a house, what you're going to do about your granny's care, what you're going to do about your children's future. That's what wins this debate. And so to me, I said it's a serious debate because I think Nicola Sturgeon's head is in the wrong place. And she talks about a Catalan official. That didn't work in Catalonia. It's not going to work in Scotland either. There is no progress to be made for us in the courts.
What I'm suggesting is the whole premise of why does it need to be through a referendum? Why can't it be through simply the Scottish MPs pulling the plug on the Treaty of Union by withdrawing from it?
Because we've already, I watched a debate online today, and it reminded me of the SNP's position 25 years ago was that if ever there was a majority of Scottish MPs elected at Westminster from Scotland, that was a mandate for independence. Well, they've had that for 10 years. Then the position changed to as if there's ever a majority of MSPs in the Holyrood Parliament for independence, then that was a mandate for independence. And we've had that since 2007 or 2011, an absolute majority. And so we're in the ludicrous position now that the SNP government, the SNP as a party in Scotland, have fought 5 elections in a row now without mentioning independence once. Because they're more interested in winning seats in Parliament and at Holyrood than progressing the case for independence. And actually, this is very similar to what happened to the Labour Party 100 years ago. Labour Party arrives on the scene, the party of working people, we're for socialism, and all of a sudden that is abandoned by the idea, Mark, we need to have MPs in Parliament. We need to have representatives in the House of Lords, for God's sake, Labour. So in other words, they were completely, their purposes was completely cut across. And so my position is, and my attitude is, it was the right thing to do to decide a referendum, a one-off question, not one that's hidden amongst all the manifesto commitments of 100 different things you could talk about a general election about. It was a one-off question and a winner takes all. If Scotland votes to be independent, it becomes independent. And by the way, in 2014, as you know, it was respected by both sides. That's the right tactic. That's the right tactic for this. And we have to confront the single most important thing we need to do is to get a majority of the people of Scotland behind the proposition that they support independence. And we've not yet done it. So let's do the first thing properly rather than get all complicated and get back into history.
I understand that, but we've discussed at length this concerns in our weekly group, and what our view is that is given the media context, everything that's going on, COVID, Brexit, all that, it's very, very difficult for the Scots to make an informed choice on whether independence is a good thing or not. And we hear the SNP leaders say, "Oh, we have to shift people over to believe in Scottish independence." Yeah, believe is good, but knowledge of what it's actually going to be is, in my view, much more important. For example, I know you want a socialist Scotland. I do too. But if people are just saying, "Okay, vote for independence, and then we'll see what happens,"
it's never going to work.
There's no
guarantee. Never going to work.
So just saying our approach is that we've sent this letter that you can read and anybody else can see it on yours. If you go to Yours for Scotland, Ian Lawson's blog, the letter is right there. So please feel free to go read it. But that quickly the Scottish government, the Westminster MPs should pull the plug on the union and just simply dissolve the Scottish party of the treaty. And it doesn't matter how old it is. That's irrelevant. The Scottish Union is the union with England and Scotland is the basis of the union. And so if it goes, the union goes. And then the Scottish Parliament, with its pro-independence majority, passes a resolution making the Scottish Parliament the supreme parliament within Scotland and the sole representative of the sovereignty of the Scottish people. And as I've said, we've contacted the European Free Trade Association, and they would consider that sufficient for them to accept Scotland into EFTA and back into the single market. And so, if this policy was pursued, Scotland could be in the single market relatively quickly. And independent, and and we've gone through this with numerous experts who know what they're talking about, and there's no legal impediment in the insane, unwritten Scottish constitution. There's nothing that prevents this from going forward.
Well, that may or may not be the case, but there's a huge flaw in your proposition, and that is that the SNP are an electoralist party. So the SNP are not going to give up their seats in the House of Commons. And we have to talk Turkey. The MPs from Scotland, who are in favour of independence are all in the SNP. And the SNP is an electoralist party. The reason they don't argue the case for independence in elections to Holyrood and to Westminster is their conclusion is it's unpopular. They will lose seats if they do so. So they don't talk about independence because they know, for example, there's a third of SNP supporters who don't support independence. So if they put independence in it, their conclusion is that they will lose seats about it. Now, that's their consideration. The Scottish Socialist Party is not an electoralist party. Our attitude is that politics belongs to the streets, belongs to the people. The idea of how life changes and how politics changes is not, we're not a party that's somehow manacled to Westminster and to the parliamentary system. So much so that my answer to the Section 30 conundrum is, if the supporters of independence approach Boris Johnson and say, we need a second referendum, he says, neat, you're not getting it. Like Khrushchev bangs his shoe on the table, no. And he says, you can't have it. You go, okay, fine. Then we'll make you extra parliamentary activities. Well, extra parliamentary, and people say, oh, well, extra parliamentary tradition in Britain is alien to us. And then the Scottish Socialist Party is able to turn around and go, really? There's such a thing called the anti-poll tax campaign. In 1989, the people of Scotland rose up, and along the rest of Britain a year later, 16 million people refused to pay the poll tax and overthrew the Thatcher government. All the Labour MPs were in favour of the poll tax, or at least they were sending in sheriff officers to chuck poor people in the street. And I have to say, the SNP MPs would have done the same. The reality was it was an extra parliamentary struggle that resulted in the overthrow of a prime minister. So Britain does have a tradition. The suffragettes is another one. There's many, avenues can be deployed. I accept entirely that it's not a common feature, and that there would be certainly the biggest opponents of any extra parliamentary strategy would be the parliamentarians who'll say, Mark, I hear your question and I realise what you're saying, I'll raise it in the House. And you go, yeah, you raise it in your house and I'll raise it in my house and see if there's a blind bit of difference. What politics is about the street, about the living reality that people go through on a daily basis.
But what I'd like to ask you is, what is the mechanism? I mean, our group has proposed what we have, and what we see is that if these steps are taken quickly, and then we begin to build the Scottish state, we develop a constitution, and after a 2-year period, we put it to a confirmatory referendum to where there is. So, do you want to continue on this route of building Scotland, or do you want to maybe negotiate it? So there would be a democratic ratification of it, but it would be informed consent. It wouldn't just be vote for independent Scotland. What does that mean?
I think that avenue and that path you're on is very valuable. I would say more power to your elbow. Keep going. But it'll become more vital in due course, because a question you referred to earlier on this conversation is 2014 we lost. And we've not, if we're honest about it, and we must be honest among ourselves, the yes side have not sufficiently sat down and said, why did we lose? Why did we lose into it? It wasn't the media. It wasn't the other side's fault. Our case wasn't persuasive enough. We lost it principally because the economic case was full of holes like Gorgonzola cheese. And it still is. That's why we're behind in the polls. The economic case is pants. And why is it pants? Because the Sustainable Growth Commission came out with a set of proposals, neoliberal proposals that say Scotland should be like Ireland. No, the corporations don't pay any taxes, low wages, money can go around the world. Scotland could be just like the latest begging bowl country because power, financial capital's got to run the world and Scotland's just got to give into that. And the truth is, what that means for working people is it means that a third of children in Glasgow continue to live in poverty.
Right on.
It means that a third of people in Scotland continue to suffer fuel poverty. They continue to have one of the most unequal societies in the world. And for socialists like me who support independence, we're not going to sell that round the doors. That's not the model of independence. You'll never win a vote on that basis with the majority of the population of Scotland behind it. And they've got to be our first concern. They've got to be the first people that we persuade, and we've not done it yet. We've not done it yet.
And that's why we advocate our view of getting towards independence. Is that unplug from Westminster, start designing the state, and then once it's clear what the state will be like, where we can guarantee these things, then people can vote. But this whole thing about even if Boris Johnson granted a Section 30 order tomorrow, there's all kinds of problems with the franchise. There's always all kinds of problems. They're
piddling problems. Those ones, relatively speaking, are piddling problems. The problem the independence movement has got, one of the problems we've got is we've not yet reconciled the type of Scotland we want to have in an independent country. I'll give you two examples. First of all, I believe there's a majority in Scotland for a republic. The majority of the people of Scotland think a monarchy is an outdated feudal relic that the rest of Europe got rid of in the 16th century, and we're still lumbered with it, and it's not insignificant, it's not unpowerful. She's the Queen's the head of state, an unelected, unrepresentative, divine right of kings, and yet the independence movement has never addressed whether we address that, conclude that we need a republic, a modern democratic republic, or will we just say, no, don't open up that can of worms, people want to keep the Queen, they love the Queen, all that stuff. And
I think it's a vanishing percentage of the population that would want to keep the Queen. And that's why I would continue to advocate the SSRG's path, because then we can design the state and say, no, we'll be a republic, or maybe
I don't have to say.
Maybe at the end there could be a vote on whether to to keep the monarchy or whatever.
How we do it. That's what I'm saying. It's a minor question.
Setting it up in advance, and so people know exactly what they're voting for.
But it alludes to the second question that I pointed out. Is independence about change, or is it about keeping the status quo? Is independence about something profound and different, that we take responsibility, that we're in charge, that the people of Scotland are in charge of their own destiny? Or is it about we keep the pound, we keep the Queen, we keep NATO, we keep the EU, we keep the corporations in charge? In which case you go, what is this about? There's no change at all. What's the point of making any changes? And to me, I find increasingly, and have done through the whole independence debate, the people who need to be persuaded the most are the poorest Scots.
Right on.
The people who want change, and who frankly, they're desperate for change. They're living in poor conditions. They're suffering poor wages. They're worried about their future. They're worried about their mum's care. They're worried about their kids' future, etc. Sure. They're the ones we need to persuade. Too many of the leadership of the independence movement think they're already in the bag, and it's somehow the middle class, the cosseted, privileged Scots, the elite, who are not supporters of independence, that we need to lean over towards. Nothing could be further from the truth. And therefore, you've got an independence movement whose leadership with the Sustainable Growth Commission is basically saying we need to cut back in public services so that the private sector can be free to make profits and push the public sector. The NHS has to be smaller. Local authorities have to be smaller. We need to privatise this and privatise that. That is crazy. That is lunatic. That's the very opposite of the direction we need to move in. And we'll never get independence if we pursue those kind of policies.
And again, I think you're helping to make my point, is that these things have to, before any real vote, you can say, there's the polls where we haven't convinced them yet, but people don't know what to believe. I mean, if you say, Scotland will be like that, how do you know? Who said that? What is the official policy on that? How do we know that if we vote for an independent Scotland, that we will get that? And that's why it's our view is that you need to set this stuff up, and not just,
of course, absolutely,
not just in the sense of putting on pamphlets or something like that. No, making it concrete. You
have to give guarantees. I'm afraid it's like
exactly.
Part of the reason I went through the 2012 to 14 referendum, and people say, Colin, we'll have to leave that until we get independence. Leave this till we get independence. Leave what the living wage will be to get independence. Leave how many council houses we're going to build. Leave whether it's a republic or not till after independence. And you go, I'm afraid you've got this upside down. Unless we settle these questions in advance and people know the prospectus that they're voting on, you're never going to win a vote. You're never going to win unless you proceed and you're honest and upfront with people in advance, Yeah,
and we can't. But the thing is, it needs to be binding. It can't be like and again, that's kind of going back to our scenario. Is like, look, pull the plug on the union. Design the Scottish state, include all of these things, republic, this and that, and at the end they vote for it as being legally binding. And this is what we're voting for. This is the state the Scottish state will have, And I think that it's folly just to say, of this Section 30. Okay, maybe Nicola Sturgeon calls it. Even Boris Johnson grants it. There's going to be so much propaganda. There's going to be so much. And the franchise, for example, because the franchise in 2014, as I understand it, was based on the local council voting lists. And so people with second homes, people with, could vote in something that I think should be more reserved for.
I mean, one of the things we have to look at, the 2014 referendum, it was the biggest turnout of any electorate in Scotland, because remember, 16 and 17-year-olds got to vote for the very first time. It was the first time that 16 and 17-year-olds had got to vote for anything. So that extended the franchise. Yeah. And of course, it's right. I mean, my attitude is, if you live in Scotland and you contribute towards society here and, you raise your family, etc., it's right that you should vote here. This argument that, for example, skullduggerous, if that's even a word, skullduggerous people, unionists like George Galloway, who were saying, we should allow those Scots who live abroad to vote in vote in a second referendum. And his inference is that, that the Scottish, they live in Australia, they live in Canada, South Africa, the States, England, wherever. No. People who live here who should vote for it.
I live in
and regardless
France.
of where they come from, a third of the city of Edinburgh is people from an English background. And it's quite right. This is their city as much as anybody's. It's their country as much as anybody. So those of us who live here, pay our taxes here, build the civic Scotland that we share, do as best we can to make the country as best we can be. We're the ones who'll decide our future. That's what the rights of nations to self-determination that dear old Lenin behind me wrote about. That's the principle, and it's the right one, and I subscribe to it. I have no problem with that.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's just I see a lot of questions coming up and comments, and so our viewers know, we really appreciate all of them. I can see them, but we don't always have time to address them. But but just going back to an earlier point, I'm just really nervous about any referendum that would come up without somehow it being, and because I got involved in 2012. I'm an academic in France. My dad was Scottish. I love Scotland. I've been, but I've never actually lived there.
Vive la France.
Exactly. But I just took an interest in it, back in 2011, 2012. I was like, because it was just after Salmon had won, they had won the majority in favor of a referendum and all that. And I hadn't really thought that much about Scottish independence, but I was like, it's just like, duh.
No, it's a fascinating question if you're interested in politics. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'd say is, you've referred to it a few times through the show, which is great. I think one of the things we can appreciate is the tactics of the unionists are dead straightforward. They have no intention whatsoever of granting a second referendum. Not now, not ever. They're going through a process just now saying, like Theresa May did, not just now. It's not the right time for it. She said, and unfortunately,
unfortunately, so is Nicola Sturgeon.
Yeah. Well, we'll come to her in a second. But on the unionist side of it, right now, they're saying it's not the right time because of COVID, and it'll not be the right time next year because we're recovering from COVID, and it'll not be the right time after that, etc., etc. That's because their tactic is that they're not going to ever have another one. If there's to be a second referendum, we're going to have to force it. we're going to have to make them an offer they can't refuse. And I think Nicola Sturgeon knows this to be the case too. So she's been play acting, in the independence movement. There's been many people, I'm sure you've done it in your show before, have highlighted that every year since 2016, Nicola Sturgeon has promised us the referendum would be next year. 2017, it would be next year. And Theresa May called her bluff by calling the general election, where the SNP then lost 12 seats, remember. So 2018, it was going to happen next year. 2019, it was going to happen next year. 2020, she didn't because of COVID. And she's saying it'll not be next year either. It'll be halfway through this parliament, etc. And I know Nicola Sturgeon quite well. We sat in the advisory board together. And Nicola is a very serious politician who realises that if there's no majority in the polls, she'll not be calling a referendum. She's no daft. She doesn't want a second referendum we're going to lose either. So she's best she can come up with is to delay it. Next year. I'm a Motherwell supporter. Every year, Motherwell supporters think that their team's going to do better next year. Next year we'll do better. Next year we'll do better. Next year, of course, it never comes. And the reality is, until there's a majority in the polls, the call for a referendum is never going to happen. Because that's the key to unlocking that door.
But that's exactly why the Section 30 referendum route is not the way to go.
Well, unless you get a majority, of course. If you get that majority, and now then Nicola Sturgeon's in big trouble.
But you're not going to get you're not going to get a majority until the terms of what Scotland will be after are spelled out clearly. And given the way that it worked in 2014, that can't happen.
Well, you're right. I agree with it, except that the Scottish Socialist Party is doing its best, and we're not the only ones. Yourselves and others, we're doing our best to make the case better. If we've at least identified what's wrong with the existing cases. Economically, it's full of holes. It's utterly contradictory. It's pointing us in the wrong direction. So we need to get rid of that, and we need to come up with an economic case that basically says we're looking for a social democratic answer. We want improved public services, not worse ones. We want higher taxes for the well-off rather than lower taxes for corporations. So there's plenty of things we already know that we need to be arguing for. And when we start saying we're raising taxes on the corporations, in order, let's say, for example, to provide a national care service in Scotland. Hugely popular, but Nicola's involved in silly games, suggesting we can somehow have a national care service in Scotland, and the way she puts it is on a par with the NHS for £113 million. The NHS in Scotland's got a budget of £13 billion. So how on earth she can come up with a national care service that would basically be the same as a small cottage hospital is ludicrous. And it's because she doesn't give adequate attention to the fact that you could raise the money for a national care service, probably a couple of £1 billion it would cost, free at the point of need, fit for the 21st century, with care staff paid a living wage that you can live on, that would encourage career development, encourage people to get into the profession. That's the kind of message that the Scottish population want to hear, that if you rally round, you go, if that's what independence means, we're the part of Scotland, we're the part of Britain, remember, it don't pay prescriptions. They don't pay, they're £9.50 an item in England for a prescription still. We've got free elderly care here, no tuition fees. That's the independence route to winning victory.
No, exactly. And just to go back to my former point that I was speaking about, when I started, I started in 2012, exactly 2 years before the referendum. I started writing a column for Newsnet Scotland about constitutions and the need for one. And my first article, I wrote, Scotland's got a blank slate, and what they should do is Scotland should set out a written constitution that they will adopt if they become, if there's a yes vote. And the unionists can do the same. They can say, okay, if you vote for, what eventually really became the vow, but of course that was ignored. But they didn't do that. That wasn't part of it. There was so much incrementalism. Oh, we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to do this. We don't want to offend the Queen. We don't, and people were confused. And so, but what I was suggesting in that first article that I wrote is it has to be legally binding. It can't, for people to be comfortable, because otherwise it'll just be another, promise that's not delivered. And, I mean, you say, do you want a socialist Scotland? Hell yeah. Do you want all these things? Of course. I'll vote for that. But they won't vote. But my final point is they won't vote for like these ambiguous sort of promises. I'll be a socialist Scotland, no problem. How do we know that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's two themes to your question. One is how untrustworthy politicians are. They appear to be saying something, and Nicola Sturgeon's a classic example. Nicola likes to exude that she's saying something, and actually the words allow all sorts of get-out clauses. Every 5 minutes she can say, no, it's not actually what I said, a national care service on a par with the NHS, just as a principle rather than feint. But that point you raised there, I think, is exceptionally important. A written constitution. Britain doesn't have a written constitution. What a radical departure for independence supporters to pick up and say, Britain doesn't have a written constitution for a reason. It doesn't have a written constitution because it likes to have these vague, interpretive, precedent-ridden, unwritten constitution to defend the powers of the ruling classes. So it's again another really good example. The independence movement should commit itself to a written constitution, as you said, with rights legally guaranteed, specifically written down, referring to us all as citizens. And by the way, not everybody in Britain has not yet achieved the status of being a citizen. We are subjects.
I know.
I mean, how condescending and insulting is that in the 21st century, that we are subjects of Her Majesty? God Almighty, we've not even climbed out of the primordial swamp to be citizens yet. So we're citizens. We've a written constitution. We've guaranteed right to the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of liberty, but specifically the right to housing, the right to a job that doesn't exploit you, the right to so many hours a week, the right to this, the right to that healthcare, the right to welfare provision, the right to a pension when you retire that you can live on. That would be fantastic. What a starting point that should be. Get on with that constitution.
I've already developed one.
As soon as this program's finished, you get on with your pen and start writing all these details down.
No, I already have. No, I've been developing one, and I'll be happy to send it to you.
It's a huge plus for us. It's a huge plus for us.
It is.
The other side will never they'll never relent to this. They'll never.
But they haven't taken advantage of that. And I know that people I've worked with, Elliot Bulmer, John Drummond, they propose the same thing. It's like run on a written constitution, at least a kind of a basic transitory,
make it as specific as you possibly can. It can be done, you don't have to say it'll be £3, 14 shillings in a groat bobby. You can put specific guarantees to say the right to a house, the right to fuel, living a life free from fuel poverty. You can go through it all and say this is a world that is fit to live in and is so diametrically opposed to what you're offered by the British state. I mean, I was in London a couple of weeks ago, Mark, for my 30th wedding anniversary. I used to stay there. I lived there for 10 years.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. Very kind. I'll tell the missus. And I went round London, and it's honest to God, they're just building everywhere. Liverpool Street, the city, the East of London. I used to live in the poor, impoverished part of East London. There's now a cable car in London that takes you from one side of the River Thames to the other. There's no mountain or anything. It just goes, the Emirates, it goes from North Woolwich to Canning Town, the poor part of what used to be where the Olympic Stadium is now. And you're like that. In Scotland, we bring out the bunting if they open a new shopping centre. And here in London, they're spending trillions. And the other thing that strikes you, because I lived there for 10 years, and you pick this up right away, you're reminded immediately, London doesn't give a damn about anywhere else in Britain.
Yeah, I know.
They couldn't care less what's happening in Watford. So the idea what's going on in Wishaw being a factor in our calculations is ludicrous. And that's the problem, that you've had 100 years in Britain of an overheating southeast of England economy, much to their detriment, I have to say, when the average house price in London is £545,000, then that's a real problem for people who are earning £25,000 a year, ever to get a house that's worth to live in, so enormous problems. And that's why those of us who support independence can take some solace for the fact that the union is falling apart. Yeah. It's never cared about the rest of Britain outside of London. Look at the north of England. and how they feel alienated
Karen,
from the southeast of England as well.
At least as they hold the southeast holds the north of England at least as low esteem as Scotland. So
it might as well be a different country.
I wanted briefly to wrap it up. I first of all want to say to all of our viewers, Independence Live has just put out a new crowdfunder. So please donate. You can see the support Independence Live, independencelive.net/donate. So please do. I don't depend on donations at all. I have a job that where I can do this on a voluntary basis, but my colleagues, Kevin and Paul and others really need this. So please donate on their behalf in terms of, in terms of being able to produce and do all these amazing shows that, while they may not seem that important now, they are literally making archives for history. I mean, they've done thousands and thousands of different events. And again, you might not watch a 3-hour march, but they're creating archives for history. So please contribute, and I'm sure Colin would agree with that. So Colin, anything you'd like to say to wrap it up?
No, I think the independence movement's in a position where, I said this to your colleagues, I think before, that on the face of it, there seems to be nothing happening. The polls are similar. They're all about the same. There's been lots and lots of them. I actually take some comfort from the fact that the very idea of independence is becoming much, much more legitimate than it's ever been. It's been legitimized. More and more people, given the fact we've not been talking about it too much in the last 2 years, actually you would have thought that the support for independence should be dribbling away. It hasn't. It's remained solid. And I take great comfort from that, because I believe that when we get the chance to make the case for independence, we can get that majority. And that remains our purpose and our priority for every last one of us. We want to be in the winning side. We want to secure independence for Scotland. And that is an enormous goal, an enormous reward for all our efforts that we do in Indie Live and the SSP, right across the independence movement. That's our victory. And that's what victory looks like, keeping our eyes on the prize, to quote Martin Luther King. Okay.
And to complement that and to finish it off, I totally agree with everything you say. I just think that that an alternate route to a there should be a referendum, but a confirmatory referendum once there has been established exactly what voting to either to continue on the path of creating an independent Scotland or going back to some kind of union with England. But we have different slightly divergent views on how to get there, but I don't think we're in any controversy about the overall objectives and what the prize is. So okay, so Colin, thank you very much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
Back anytime, and had just a fantastic.
I'm happy to do so. Best of luck. Thank you.
Sure.